Hello and a very warm welcome to you. Have you ever really thought about how a sacred text defends itself? It's a fascinating question. Today, we're going to do a deep dive into a really remarkable passage from the Quran, Surah Ash-Shu'ara, verses 192 to 212. What's so amazing about this section is that it lays out this powerful, systematic argument for its own divine origins. Honestly, it reads almost like a legal brief, and we're going to unpack it together step by step.
So, to really feel the power of these verses, we've got to set the scene. Imagine this. The Prophet Muhammad, peace be upon him, wasn't just met with a bit of skepticism. No, he was facing a full-on barrage of accusations. People were calling him a poet, a madman, even a sorcerer who was getting his words from devils. And these weren't just schoolyard insults. They were serious, damaging charges. The verses we're about to explore, there are a direct point-by-point rebuttal to every single one of those claims. So, how exactly does the Quran build its case? Well, here's our roadmap for today. First, we're going to see how it establishes its own divine blueprint. Then, we'll get into a really tough question. Why do people disbelieve, even when the signs seem so clear? After that, we'll explore the idea of divine justice and its warnings. And finally, we get to the knockout punch, the ultimate takedown of the claim that this was all just demonic inspiration. It's truly a masterclass in theological argument.
All right, let's start right at the foundation. Before it even starts to tear down the accusations, the text does something incredibly clever. It establishes its own credentials. It says, okay, before we talk about what I'm not, let me tell you exactly what I am and where I come from. This creates a rock-solid base for the whole argument that's about to unfold.
And right away, we see this incredible chain of transmission, presented as a totally secure, unhackable channel of communication. Think about it. First, you have the source, the Lord of all worlds. Can't get more authoritative than that. Then, the courier, the trustworthy spirit, the angel Gabriel. Next, the recipient, the prophet's very heart. And finally, the language itself, a clear, eloquent Arabic tongue. Every single link in this chain is designed to scream authenticity and integrity.
Let's just zoom in on that courier for a second. The text doesn't just say an angel brought it. It uses this very specific, very powerful title, Ruh al-Amin, which means the trustworthy spirit. Now, that's not just a fancy name. It's a direct counter-argument, right? If people are accusing you of getting your message from some unreliable, shady source, what's the very first thing you do? You establish the impeccable character of your messenger.
And this is where the whole thing gets even more profound. The revelation wasn't just something the prophet heard with his ears or memorized with his mind. The phrase, upon your heart, tells us something much deeper was going on. It means this message was placed in the seat of his understanding and conviction. It was deeply internalized, becoming a part of his very being. This wasn't just data transfer. It was true, heartfelt guidance.
So, why Arabic? Well, this was an absolutely deliberate, strategic choice. Of course, on a basic level, it had to be understood by the people who heard it first, but it's so much more than that. The Arabs of that time were absolute masters of language and poetry. So by revealing the Quran in the most beautiful, eloquent Arabic, it was like a master painter walking into a gallery of the world's best artists and unveiling something they could all recognize as genius, but could never, ever replicate.
Okay, so if the source is divine, the messenger is trustworthy, and the language is undeniably brilliant and clear, that brings us to the big question, right? Why on earth did people still reject it? The Quran sees this question coming a mile away, and it dedicates this next part of the argument to explaining the very logic of disbelief.
And this is where the logic gets really sharp. The text basically says, look, think about this for a second. If we had sent this revelation down in a language you didn't understand, a foreign tongue, you would have had the perfect excuse to just shrug and say, sorry, can't understand it, not for me. But by revealing it in perfect Arabic, their own language, that excuse is completely taken off the table. Their rejection couldn't be about misunderstanding anymore. It had to be about something else, something deeper, like stubborn pride, or just an unwillingness to accept the truth.
Now, this next verse, whoa, it can be a tough one to wrap your head around. It says God inserts disbelief into the hearts of criminals. Does that mean God forces people to disbelieve? Well, according to centuries of Islamic scholarship, the answer is a firm no. This isn't about God randomly deciding who believes. It's about a spiritual law of cause and effect. The idea is, if someone just keeps rejecting the truth again and again out of pure arrogance, eventually God allows their own choices to harden their heart. It's a consequence, not a predetermined fate.
So we've explored the why behind disbelief. Now the passage raises the stakes and asks the ultimate question, so what? What are the real consequences of this rejection? This next section is a really powerful look at divine justice and the seriousness of the choice.
The text paints a very vivid picture for us here. Just imagine someone who seems to have it all. Years and years of wealth, power, and worldly pleasure. It's so easy to look at that and think, wow, they must be doing something right. God must be pleased with them, right? But then the verse says, suddenly, accountability arrives. And in that one moment, what good will all those years of enjoyment do them? The text's answer is chilling. Absolutely none. Worldly success isn't proof of divine favor. It's a test.
And naturally, this leads us to a fundamental moral question, a question that the text knows we're going to ask. Wait a minute, is this fair? How can a God who is just and merciful punish anyone? It's a valid question, so let's see how the Quran itself answers it.
So the Quran lays out a very clear, very consistent pattern. It's like a divine protocol for justice. God never punishes a community without first sending them a messenger, a warner. That warner gives everyone a clear heads up, a chance to listen, to think, and to change their ways. Punishment, the text argues, is always the absolute last resort, coming only after that warning has been knowingly and persistently ignored. And the verse seals this principle with a powerful statement, and never have we been unjust.
And now, we've arrived at the grand finale of this argument. This is the final, decisive rebuttal. The text is about to take on the most serious, the most damaging accusation of them all, that the Quran doesn't come from God, but from devils.
The core of the argument here is really just common sense. It's about fundamental incompatibility. Just look at the nature of the two things. The Quran's message is all about worshiping one God, being moral, being just, and ultimately saving yourself. A message from a devil would be the polar opposite: chaos, immorality, destruction. The two are like oil and water. They just don't mix. The text is basically saying the accusation isn't just false, it's completely illogical.
But it doesn't just leave it at that general idea. Oh no, it goes a step further and offers this incredible, two-pronged rebuttal. It argues that it's impossible for devils to produce the Quran for two very specific reasons. One is a moral reason, and the other is a metaphysical one.
So here's the breakdown. First, the moral impossibility. It is not allowable for them. It literally goes against their very nature as beings of mischief to deliver a message of pure truth and guidance. It's like asking a wolf to sincerely guard the sheep. It just doesn't compute. And second, the metaphysical impossibility. Nor would they be able. Even if, by some bizarre twist, they wanted to, they simply don't have the power or the ability to create or transmit something with the divine weight and eloquence of the Quran. So they are neither willing nor are they able.
And just when you think the case is closed, the argument delivers the final, decisive blow. It takes this powerful turn and says, you know what, it's not just the devils can't produce the revelation. They can't even get close enough to eavesdrop on it.
And this slide just says it all. 0. According to the text, the heavens are guarded. And with the coming of this final revelation, the devils were completely blocked, banished from listening in on any divine communication. So if they have 0 access, how on earth could they possibly be the source? It shifts the accusation from being just improbable to being utterly impossible.
And that brings us to our final thought for today. We've just walked through how a sacred text builds this intricate, logical case for its own authenticity. So how does knowing that change the way we read it? How does understanding a text's own self-defense affect our analysis, our faith, or even our skepticism? It's a deep question, one that really gets to the heart of how we engage with sacred literature. Thank you so much for joining me on this journey today.